Sunset Boulevard is the story of how Joe Gills died. Joe Gills is the narrator of the story told in a flashback, a writer aspiring to get into Hollywood. His arc centers primarily on two relationships: Betty Schaefer, a reader he meets in the beginning of the story, and his relationship with Norma Desmond, the greatest star of all, who hires him as an advisor and low-key kidnaps him in the process. Maybe too strong a wording. She makes him stay at her home. Joe meets Norma when she's preparing the funeral for her pet monkey, in a situation that, seen from Joe's perspective, is quite pathetic. Looking through his bedroom window into the backyard, he says,
"Was her life really as empty as that?"
This comment he makes early in their relationship to me codifies much of how he, and in consequence the movie, see Norma Desmond throughout: an isolated, sad, empty woman who deserves pity. And pity will she get from Joe. Near the middle of the story, she tries to commit suicide, not for the first time, and the scene following that is the first time in the movie we see a meek Norma Desmond. On to Betty Schaefer's and Joe's relationship. Betty is already set to marry Joe's friend RT when she begins the relationship with Joe, who she met as she was decimating his script without knowing he was in the room.
It was just a rehash of something that wasn't very good to begin with.
Their relationship becomes a professional one first, and even when it becomes romantic, there's very little chemistry anywhere to be found there. Near the end of the movie, Betty opens up to Joe. Joe never opens up to her. Joe never opens up to Betty, he never opens up to anyone. All his relationships lack chemistry because he is the one who's empty. The lack of any information about him prior to the events of the movie make him into a character who lacks depth to his life. Even his approach to writing is telling. He begrudges Betty because she would like to send a message with her movie. Joe's primary motivation as a creator is making money. We really didn't need to come this far to reach the conclusion that Joe is the character who's truly empty. The simple fact that he ascribed emptiness to Norma because she cared so much about the death of her pet is cause enough for concern. Why would anyone think that caring about the death of a pet is a sign of emptiness? Well, because they couldn't imagine themselves caring this much. Because they couldn't imagine anyone else caring about their death. His narration continues in the 5 minutes of movie we got after he dies. Nevertheless, after his body is pulled out from the swimming pool by the police, it's as if Joe Gills had never existed. Norma Desmond doesn't seem to remember him, and no one brought cameras for him. The monkey gets a better send-off than he does. Joe never gets to have a funeral. I decided to start with Joe Gills because Sunset Boulevard is his story, but we all know who we're all here to see. The greatest movie star of all, Norma Desmond. A creative decision that affects everything in Sunset Boulevard is the aforementioned Joe Gills perspective. Norma Desmond's introduction is one of the big moments where we get a lot of first-person perspective shots. Norma Desmond calls him from upstairs. We, like him, hear her before we see her badly through Venetian windows. Then we hear her once more before seeing her from downstairs. We get there and she's in the dark. She finally brings him to the room where she's keeping the corpse of her monkey. And we don't know who she is until Joe realizes it. And he says it out loud. One of the most iconic exchanges in the movie.
"You're Norma Desmond. Used to be in silent pictures. Used to be big."
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
This character introduction is amazing. It generates just enough suspense for the moment where we finally see her to be very satisfying. The issue really kicks in after this line. Joe spends the entire scene scoffing at her for losing her pet, for thinking that she's still big, and the movie's on his side all through this. I've already talked about the disrespect leveled against her later when she becomes so pitiful for having tried to commit suicide. But the most notable moment when it comes to disrespect is, of course, the final scene. Norma very clearly asks for a close-up on her. It's one of the most famous lines in Hollywood movie history, right?
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
And even without Joe Gills, the movie still refuses to give her what she wants. And while she approaches the camera, it fades to white before granting her requested close-up. From beginning to the end, the movie's trying to make us not see Norma as she sees herself. Not the greatest movie star of all, no, of course not, but just a crazy old woman. Someone who needs psychological help to stop trying to commit suicide, which, in fairness, maybe she does. Someone who lost her community and her career. Someone who lives completely in a world of her own. While I appreciate any movie that commits to a strong creative decision, the Joe Gills perspective is ultimately what makes the viewing experience of Sunset Boulevard less enjoyable for me. Whenever we get another scene without Norma Desmond, all I can think about is, who cares? Give me more Norma. When she says,
Because they want to see me, Norma Desmond.
I agree with her. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? So, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is a movie that often gets criticism of the sexism variety. Its central character is a woman who resents the loss of her youth, a villainous addict who has gone insane because of her old age. Since I started talking about this movie again, one of the first things that people comment the most about this movie is just how terrifying it is. And I think that whenever people say this, one of the big scenes that comes to mind is this one. The one that focuses on Bette Davis's wrinkled face, using her old age to elicit fear. Ready for the big hot take of the video? Jane gets more respect from her movie than Norma does. Let's start with where I left off Sunset Boulevard, the perspective. Unlike in Sunset Boulevard, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane doesn't have a clear point of view character or narrator. It starts with a somewhat detached perspective on a performance that Baby Jane is doing for a crowd who loves her. Then we get to see her as a brat, her parents, and sister. Then we get a proper introduction to child Blanche, crying in jealousy. After this, we get a second introduction to both characters, their roles somewhat reversed. This time, Jane is being derided by Hollywood execs because of her bad acting, and Blanche is mentioned as someone who throws amazing parties and seems to be very well respected in the acting industry. Then finally, in the present day, we are first presented to Blanche, and she's clearly a star as her neighbors watch her movies and they seem offended on her behalf because the reruns of her classics are being used to sell dog food. Her neighbors, at least, seem to have all the respect possible for Blanche Hudson. Then we go to her room where she's also watching the reruns of her own movies, and she's depicted as composed, critical, and she doesn't seem bitter at all about her former career. Even when she's critical of her past, she seems lighthearted here. And then Jane. She's reading the horoscope, drinking and cursing. From the first moment to get to see her in the present day, she's unsympathetic. After this point, the movie mostly sticks to both sisters' perspectives. The fact that we get to see Jane through her own perspective and through the perspective of someone who had a previous relationship to her make her feel like a much more multidimensional character than Norma does. At least on a first viewing. There are details in Sunset Boulevard that give Norma Desmond a lot more depth than Joe ever sees in her. While Baby Jane is clearly a villainous figure in her story, and most of the emotions she elicits in the other main character are of the fear variety, she still navigates many different feelings. I guess this is a good time to talk about how Bette Davis knocks this role out of the park. Definitely one of my absolute favorite horror movie performances of all time. The way that she causes terror 1 second, sadness the other, and then sympathy the next is... It makes me worried that I could never do true justice to the movie or to the performance by talking about it. My jaw drops every time that the scene where she pretends to be Blanche on the phone comes up. My heart beats faster every time she performs I've written a letter to Daddy completely earnestly as an adult. And that final scene! Imagine not being completely broken when she says,
All this time we could have been friends.
What I'm saying is, we live in Bette Davis's world and I am blessed to be allowed in it. Speaking of which, The final scene is the one where I feel most sympathy towards Baby Jane. It's a very sad moment, and after going through the whole journey we went through, to me it feels so correct to have this story end on a sad note. And it's precisely in the sadness that I think Baby Jane gets to shine in contrast to Norma Desmond. When Norma Desmond tries to commit suicide, she becomes a pitiful creature. Contrast that to Baby Jane in one of the most iconic scenes where she and Blanche are looking through a window, and that's the first time that we ever see Jane in a genuinely sad moment. We already have so many feelings towards her that this little sad moment is not going to manage to overcome the fear and threat that she poses to Blanche. She changes from one register to another so fast that we are never allowed time to pity her. And the very final scene feels very Sunset Boulevard because it is the first time that people are giving attention to Baby Jane Hudson in a long time. But the truth is, we never get the disrespect that Norma got in her final scene. Jane just gets to dance in the beach. And finally, the one thing that I think makes Baby Jane never become a pitiful creature is her power. Rewatching Whatever Happened to Baby Jane for this video, there was a point where I wondered if there was something to be discussed in regards to character agency in the comparison with Sunset Boulevard, but I don't think it's so much about agency in the plot, because Norma Desmond is pivotal in 3 of the most important moments for the main character in Sunset Boulevard. 1, she's the one who makes him stay in the beginning. 2, she's the one who gets him to stay in her house again in the middle of the story when she tries to commit suicide. And then 3, she's the one who kills him. Saying that she doesn't have agency in Sunset Boulevard's plot would be wrong. What I was really noticing was the amount of power that each character is depicted as having. Norma needs to get a gun to start being perceived as a threat by anyone. Up until that point, Jo was just leaving the house behind her back all the time. The only leverage she seems to have for most of the story is, again, suicide. Which I personally cannot see as a very powerful move, as she's hurting herself more than anyone else whenever she needs to get to someone. Jane Hudson, on the other hand, is so powerful that once you start noticing how infallible she is, the movie starts getting quite ridiculous. There's a good hour and a half of the runtime where pretty much all of the main actions are someone tries to help Blanche, sometimes Blanche tries to help herself, and not being able to because Jane holds all the power in the situation and catches them before they succeed. While the plot hinges on Jane's former lack of power, in Hollywood, financial, mental, back in the 30s she was already an addict, the events of the movie are at a point where Jane has found a situation where she can be in control of and is ready to exploit. There is one character in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane who's a little bit analogous to Joe Gills, and his name is Edwin Flagg. And there are a couple of scenes where we see him looking at Jane in a secondhand embarrassment type of way. This is the closest we ever get to seeing anyone pity her. I try to have an open mind when it comes to bad representation. What does it mean? I remember the first time that I watched Whatever Happened to Baby Jane as a teenager, and I loved Baby Jane. She's evil, but she's memorable, she's powerful, her emotions are nuanced. While I understand where many criticisms come from, of course, I have a hard time agreeing with the people who dismiss the movie too much. Precisely because I think that Baby Jane Hudson is taken extremely seriously all the way through. In many ways, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is a little bit of a spiritual successor to Sunset Boulevard. Both movies share a lot of similarities, even though most of them are superficial and not so much related to themes or characterization. One aspect both movies differ, and differ greatly, is that Sunset Boulevard doesn't feature family relationships, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane features little but family relationships. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane has quite a few lines of dialogue alluding to the importance of friendships and relationships outside of family bonds. But besides the two characters who often say those lines to each other, Edwin and Jane, we pretty much don't get any non-familial connection. Even Elvira, the one major character you don't get to see the family home of, still gets a mention of a cousin after her death, because that's the only person who's looking for her. The only people who care for each other are family, and Family is hell. Okay, not necessarily. We do get the neighbors, who seem to have a pretty good mother-daughter relationship. But besides them, we have Jen and Blanche, who are abusive on every possible imaginable level. We have the Hudson parents, who forced them as kids into showbiz and are implied to have been the cause of their feud that destroyed their entire lives. And we have the Flags, who are a dysfunctional mother-son relationship. In a different world, my video about whatever happened to Baby Jane would have been all about how the nuclear family is a cursed thing that needs to be destroyed. Having said all this, I want to bring the third and final movie that we're talking about today. What's the Matter with Helen? What is the matter with Helen? Tell me, Vanessa, what's the matter with Helen? Tell us. Tell us what's the matter with Helen. Which is yet another movie with an older woman losing her sanity, and yet another movie with two big characters playing off each other. The big difference this time is that not only are both of them mothers this time around, their entire journey in the movie is defined by their sons. The inciting incident being when they kill someone and are sent to prison, and these two women become notorious in their small town and decide to leave for Hollywood. This one has a super interesting depiction of family dynamics. First, we have the fact that motherhood is presented as a rather negative thing, since the main thing we know about their sons is the violent act they committed. Second, we have the fascinating aspect that neither son is ever shown on screen. These women's journeys is defined by motherhood, yes, but their characters are anything but. There are multiple points in the movie where it's easy to forget exactly what led them to this place. More than either of the other two movies, What's the Matter with Helen is a descent to villainy type of story, which necessitates that we meet Helen beforehand, and therefore we get to see a little bit of the good in her relationship with Adele in the first half. They seem to have a sisterhood dynamic, but Helen also seems like she might be in love with Adele, to the point where the household they established in Hollywood seems to exist in this line between sisters living together and partners. Then finally we have the romantic relationship between Adele and Link. Adele is trying to move on from her previous life, and Link is a big part of that. Watching this movie while having Sunset Boulevard fresh in my mind was interesting because at some point I noticed how much more smoothly I considered the Adele-Link plot connected to the overall narrative than I consider Betty and Joe's relationship to be in Sunset Boulevard. I know I'm banging on the same key a lot, but the fact that Joe Gill's the narrator of Sunset Boulevard truly does affect everything. The fact that Joe didn't have a former relationship with either Norma or Betty before the events of the movie makes it seem like it's going two completely different lanes that sometimes intersect with each other. In contrast, in What's the Matter with Helen, Adele cannot escape her relationship with Helen because that's always been the person who she cares about first and foremost. When Link comes into the picture, he manages to be a good B-plot, not a distraction, like Betty often feels like. Okay, I've avoided the most obvious through line that the three movies have with each other for as long as I think I reasonably could. How do each of them depict craziness? Helen's version of crazy comes from intense feelings of guilt that lead her to seeing corpses that aren't there? But are they really not? Can't we accept Helen's version of reality for a moment? All any of us can trust is our senses, and if Helen sees them, then they are as real to her as anything is to me. When you start questioning what reality really means, the concept of losing your sanity starts quickly falling apart. I alluded to the fact that Whatever Happened to Baby Jane isn't a descent to villainy type of movie. Jane is evil from the start. She does experience a regression to her childhood, and that's when she starts losing the grasp of who she really is and where she really is in her life. In the very final scene of the movie at the beach, that's when she's at her craziest. She fully believes herself to be a child. She's also at her most harmless? Yeah, Baby Jane loses her grasp on reality as well at some point, but all that struggle is internal. She doesn't know who she is anymore. Baby Jane's version of crazy also comes from feelings of guilt, sure, but they also come from being extremely manipulated, lied to, and gaslit. Ageism and sexism play a big part in her narrative and what led her here. Norma Desmond lives in her own world where her fame has never been disputed, where she never really left Hollywood and she's ready to be taken back with open arms for her return. Maybe the reason why we never get to see her from her own perspective is because she would be a little too convincing. I believe her. I believe in her stardom. And when her old friends come talk to her under the spotlight, I believe that she can go back to the community that she once had. Earlier, I contrasted Joe Gills to Norma Desmond. And the more I thought about the movie, the more I rewatched some of my favorite scenes. The more I thought about what I could take away from it, the more I realized that if I was given the choice of being Norma Desmond existing in her own little world, excuse me, existing in her own grandiose world, believing what she wants to believe, and only occasionally having a mental breakdown or two that are a little bit more serious, while she still lives with someone that she knows she can trust. Or being Joe Gills, the writer who believes nothing, has no one, and can't even cry for the death of a pet. Well, when I put it like that, the choice seems rather obvious. Thank you. Hi, welcome to Vanessa Jupiter's sitting room. You have just experienced fear of going crazy. If you've been following the channel for a while, you maybe know that I like playing a little bit with how I approach scripting and delivering the videos. When I write a video, often like I have the text that I want to talk about, in this case, whatever happened to Baby Jane, Sunset Boulevard, and What's the Matter with Helen, and usually I would have like not necessarily a thesis statement, but at least like a theme that things are building towards. Like, you might have noticed that this video fully lacked an introduction. That's not an accident, it's because I realized that the script was a lot ramblier than usual. Yeah, I wonder how this went with you, because sometimes I feel like, when I end a video, like there's like a thing to be thought. And I have no idea if this is successful in this format at all. Like, did you think? Did you do you feel like this video prompted you to think? I feel like I say this every time that I do an outro, but I think it's true. I think that one of the reasons, like I think that the videos where I do an outro are because I am genuinely more curious to know what people are thought about the video. I think that a lot of the time, if I don't do an outro, it's because I'm like super confident and I think the video that I just did is perfect. My irreversible video, go watch it, it's amazing. I'm genuinely very interested to know what you thought of this video. So please let me know, do you think that you thought? Do you think that this video made your brain go, I'll be very invested in what came after the that your brain did. Was it positive? Was it negative? Or were you just disagreeing with me the whole time? And was it a horrible experience for you? Did you just spend like 25 minutes watching me and thinking, wow, this drag queen has no idea what they're talking about? Valid. Amazing, good job. Thank you for sticking around. Let me know. Second, have you seen either of these three movies? All of these three movies? You have very strong feelings about them? This comment section is your one and only chance to start discourse on this channel about Sunset Boulevard, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and or What's the Matter with Helen. So use it wisely. Start all the discourse. Go ahead. And finally, third and final question, on a scale from love to divine adoration, what's your opinion of Betty Davis? Like, share, subscribe, tag me in your Instagram stories, quote me in your dissertation thesis, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, and I will see you next time. Love, Vanessa Jupiter. Also, not to have the outro last longer than the actual video, but there should be another video coming like the same week as this goes up, about so many movies, like about 33 movies that fall into the hexploitation genre. And if you're not excited about that, then I don't know what to tell you. You're in the wrong channel. Have fun being in the wrong channel.